Good morning. As always, I will do a little review as we're doing this because some of you weren't here the last time. So I like to go back and get a little bit of review before I get to my main topic. This morning's topic is grumbling and disputing. And that comes from Philippians, the second chapter, in verse 14. But I'm going to go back and read 12 through 14 before we get as we get started. Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent children of God, without blemish, in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation. You know, last week, if you remember, I spoke about the working out your salvation, and what that entailed. It's not working for it, it's working it out. It's the sanctification process. But as I began to look at this, what we find is the Apostle Paul actually gives a command, then he gives a how to do it, or the attitude in which to do it. Then he gives a reason for doing it that way, and he ends up with another command. So I found that interesting, that the way that was laid out. But he says, work out your salvation. And as I mentioned, that's the sanctification process. That's the command. Work out your salvation. And then he gives a how, or at least it's an attitude, with fear and trembling. So I have to ask myself, what is fear and trembling? And as I got to looking at it and researching, the fear there is a fear of displeasing God. I can remember as a young boy playing Little League Baseball. My dad was the coach. And not only in Little League Baseball, but in other areas of my life as well, I wanted to please my dad. And when I got on the practice field, I would bend over backwards trying to please him. Did I always succeed? No. But that was my attitude. If that was my attitude with my earthly father, shouldn't that much more be my attitude with my heavenly Father? Is a fear of displeasing him. And then trembling. That's having a righteous awe for him, or a respect for who he is. And think about it. He's the one that created all things. Everything belongs to him. And he chooses to have a relationship with you. That should bring an awe, a respect. So we have the command, work out your salvation. We have the attitude of doing it with fear and trembling. And now we have a reason. And I say that because verse 13 starts with the word for. For it is God who works in you. That's the reason we're to work it out, is he's working in us. And then there's another, it's God that works in us. How does he do that? Another how. Both to will and to work. God's at work in you, giving you the desire and the ability to do what he's wanting to be done in you. And then he says, do all things without grumbling or disputing. I came to a better understanding of that this week. And what he is speaking about is what he had just spoken of. God's at work in you, both to will and to work out your salvation, that sanctification process. But the grumbling and disputing is about how we grumble and dispute God working in our lives. He's not just talking about in general, but specifically how God is working in you. And we grumble. and we dispute. What is the grumbling? The grumbling is the emotional side. And it's not complaining. Complaining is when I'm speaking about it to other people, saying, look, this. Now, grumbling is under your breath, just mumbling. Matter of fact, some people say that the word that comes from out of Greek, the way it's pronounced, is the way it comes out is like a grumbling. But that's when you keep it to yourself and you're just murmuring, as one version says. And disputing, that's the intellectual side. That's when you're having that conversation with yourself and actually saying, God, I wouldn't have done it that way. God, this is not the best thing in my life right now. God, why did you do? That's the disputing. Do we do that? I think we all do. We grumble and we dispute. What we're doing is we're kicking against the providence of God. He's providentially in control. And any circumstance that you find yourself in that you may perceive as bad, He could have stopped it. And He didn't. Why? Because He's at work in you. It's all of those circumstances that you perceive as bad that God is using to shape you into the image of His Son. He's at work in you. So we need to stop complaining. We need to stop grumbling and disputing about His work in our lives. Think about this. Does God love you? I believe all of us would answer yes. Let's define love. His love, the agape type of love. It's thinking the best for that person at all times. Is that God with us? He always thinks the best and wants the best for us? Yes. Yet He allows bad, rough circumstances in your life? Yes. Why? Because He loves you. It's those circumstances that create in us that Christ-likeness by the way we respond. Most people have a wrong view of God. They don't have a biblical view. They have a God of their own imagining. And the God of that their imagining isn't one of wrath, but He is. He isn't one who allows bad things to happen in your life. He does. Your God needs to get bigger in your thinking. Do all things without grumbling or disputing. And the next time we meet, I'll go into the next verse. He gives another reason why we do those things. But as I got to thinking about this, I thought about two examples. One of a guy who did not grumble or dispute, and another one that did. You have Joseph, you know the story, sold into slavery by his brothers, thrown into prison because he was accused of rape, essentially, by Potiphar's wife. He was left in prison and overlooked several times to be taken out. I don't find scriptures where he ever complained about any of that. He never grumbled or disputed. As a matter of fact, in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, he said, speaking to his brothers, you meant it for evil. God meant it for good. He didn't kick against the providence of God. Then we have a guy by the name of Job. And when we think of Job, most people stop with, he was a man that escheweth evil. And they see the righteousness of him. And that's what we see in the beginning. But he began to grumble, and he began to dispute. Just the opposite of Joseph. He looked at his circumstances and he started questioning, why are these things happening? His answers in the beginning of the book were right on, but then he slipped into that looking at the circumstances, and he wasn't pleased. And in his pride, he said, God, you will answer me. You see what his problem was? God allowed those circumstances in his life so that he could use those to show Job his pride. Let's stop kicking against the providence of God. Let's stop grumbling and complaining and disputing the situations that are happening in our lives. Let's meditate upon these things and see what God is trying to show you through these words today. Now let's all go throw to the glory of God.